It is Wednesday, May 29th, 2013. My name is Dale Tafoya, and this is another episode of Athletics After Dark. This is podcast number 110. We want to welcome you, A's fans, listening across the globe on YouTube, iTunes, and our RSS feed, and our website, which is athleticsafterdark.com. We're a podcast and blog that celebrates the past and embraces the future of A's baseball. You know, there has been only 4 A's teams that have won over 100 games in a season since moving to Oakland in 1968. And today we're going to talk about one of those teams, the 2001 A's, led by manager Art Howe, team leader Jason Giambi, and a trio of young, talented pitchers dubbed the Big Three. Boasted a record of 102-60 that season. Many experts, in fact, including Billy Beane, have said the 2001 A's were one of the most talented teams in franchise history. And in the ALDS, after stealing 2 road wins in New York that season and heading back to Oakland in a best-of-5 series, they just couldn't finish off the Yankees and were eliminated in Game 5 in New York, which brought heartache and agony to many A's fans, including yours truly. And joining me to reflect on the swinging A's of 2001 is the radio voice of the A's himself, and he's also author of the forthcoming book, Holy Toledo, Lessons from Bill King, Renaissance Man of the Mic. His name is Ken Korach, who, along with the late Bill King and Ray Fosse, was a part of the A's radio team that season. Ken, thanks for joining us.
Well, Dale, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Ken, what jumps out at you most about the 2001 A's, and how would you rank them among the A's teams you covered?
Well, I think that we all felt back in that era that was the best team, and that it was the best team that had a chance to get to the World Series. And the other thing, as you know, Dale, is the Mariners had a phenomenal year and set the record for most wins in a season. And, of course, the A's wound up as the wild card team winning 102 games. And they finished 14 games out of first place. So even now, it's amazing to look back and think about that you finished with a record of 102-60, and yet you were 14 games out.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And, you know, taking a trip back to memory lane, before the 2001 season, Ken, the A's were coming off a 2000 season that saw them in the playoffs for the first time since 1992. And during the offseason, Billy Beane, in classic Billy Beane fashion, pulled off one of those 3-team trades that landed Johnny Damon, Corey Lytle, and minor leaguer at the time, Mark Ellis. What was the buzz during spring training of that season, Ken?
Well, it was an interesting time for us because the A's had rallied back in 2000, and the expectations were fairly high going into the 2000 season, but I'm not sure anybody predicted that the A's were going to win the division, which they did on the last day of the season, avoiding having to go to Tampa Bay and play a makeup game, and then had a series in the ALDS against the Yankees, losing in 5 games. But then, as you'll recall, and the pattern that the A's had back then, Dale, was that they had these very tough first halves, and they got out of the blocks very slowly in 2001. So I think some doubt might have crept in that they could repeat what they had done in 2000. And I always thought that what the A's did at the end of the first half, because they were under 500 going into the last 3 games of the season before the All-Star break. And you might recall that they had Mulder, Hudson, and Zito pitching the final 3 games against the Diamondbacks and Phoenix right before the break.
Sure. And
they wound up winning those games. They allowed only 2 runs in the 3 games. And then they got themselves over 500 during the All-Star break, which I've always felt is kind of a psychological thing. Everybody looks at the standings during the break, and to see that they had battled back to get over 500. And that, of course, catapulted them because in the second half they were just sensational.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I remember that 3-game series in Arizona, and that was sort of the birth of the Big Three. I believe they basically just shut the Hudson, Mulder, and Zito basically just shut the Diamondbacks that whole weekend.
Yeah, they absolutely did. They allowed just 2 runs in the 3 games. And as that season moved along, we knew that this was really special because you had these 3 great pitchers, and that's why I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, Dale, that we all thought that this was the year that the A's had a great shot if they were going to get to the World Series. And obviously Jason Giambi had a fantastic year. And you look around that club, it was a star-studded team. A lot of people look at the A's and said, well, they're a small market team. But if you were to look at those players individually, they had a lot of stars on that team.
And let's talk about this lineup, Ken. It was a lineup that led the AL in doubles, walks, and ranked second in extra base hits. Setting the table at the top of the order was Johnny Damon, center field, Miguel Tejada at shortstop, Jason Giambi at first base, Jermaine Dye, acquired in the middle of the season in right field. We'll talk about him later. Eric Chavez at third, Jeremy Giambi at DH. Then you had Olmedo Signs DH as well. Terrence Long in left field, Ramon Hernandez as the catcher, and Frank Menachino at second base. And keep in mind, Ken, all of these players were in their primes. How surprised were you that this lineup clicked so well?
Well, I think you mentioned it, that they were all in their prime, and that's why I think that sometimes payrolls can be misleading. If you took all those guys and then they were able to go into free agency right then, that would have been a very high salary team. So I don't think there were too many surprises about what they did offensively. But I will say this, one of the things that happened during that season, if you might recall, is that when the A's began the year, they had Johnny Damon playing in left field and Terrence Long was playing in center field. And then they made a switch fairly close to the middle of the season when they switched those two guys. And when Damon went out and played center field for the second half of the year, I really thought defensively that helped the A's take off. So that was one of those kind of subtle things that happened during the year that has been maybe overlooked. But when they made that switch in the outfield, I thought it really clicked for the team defensively.
And on July 24th of that season, Ken, the A's were 54-46, 18 games behind the first place Mariners, who ended up winning 116 games that season. And Billy Beane, smelling contention and in its classic fashion, spearheaded another three-team trade that landed Jermaine Dye from the Royals. And Dye proceeded to play 61 games for the A's that season and clubbed 13 homers and drove in 59 runs the rest of the way. How much of a turning point was the Dye trade?
Well, I've said this before, Dale, and you've probably heard me say this on our broadcast. That may have been the best trading deadline acquisition in the history of the game, and it sounds like a piece of hyperbole to say that. But Jermaine Dye played in 61 games for the A's that year, and he had 13 home runs and 59 runs batted in. Sure. And he really made that lineup. They already had a good lineup, but he made it all the more legitimate because now there was protection for the big guns in the middle because they had Giambi and Tejada and Chavez and Johnny Damon, who really didn't have a great offensive year, one of the poorest years offensively of his career. But the addition of Jermaine Dye was hugely important to the team, and it really gave you the sense that when they got into the postseason, that they could go toe-to-toe with anybody.
Mm-hmm. The voice you're hearing is Ken Korach, the radio voice of the A's. And, of course, you mentioned, Ken, after a shaky start, the A's were 8-18 coming out of the gate. The club mowed through opponents in the second half of the season, finishing 58-17 in their final 75 games. This franchise, Ken, is known for being unbeatable during certain stretches of a season. In 1988, the A's won 14 straight. In 2002, of course, 20 straight. They were unbeatable at the end of last season in 2012. How would you describe this run in which the A's won 58 of their final 75 games of the season, Ken?
Yeah, Dale, we almost got to the point where we were expecting it because they had these remarkable second halves. And like I said, when they got one game over 500 by winning against the Diamondbacks right before the break, and the addition of Dye, like you said when you asked that question, Dale, they just had a great club. They had outstanding pitching. They were deep in their starting pitching. They had a great bullpen. And when things start to build like they did for that team, and then you get some of the clubs in the second half that might be rebuilding, might be thinking about the future, then I think you do get a huge advantage. And they were pushing very hard because they were not going to win the division, so they had to battle just to get in there and get the wild card.
Mm-hmm. And not, as I emailed you yesterday, not many teams who win 102 games end up winning the wild card.
No, that's right, exactly. And then they had so many incredible moments that year. You know, there are things that you look back on and you think of the Sunday afternoon at the Coliseum when Giambi hit that home run against Mike Stanton. I think in every year you can point to certain things that were almost seminal, where you thought something really special is happening, and then the team develops a little bit of magic and a little bit of karma. like with last year's A's team when they had the walk-off wins. And I went back to the one that Yoenis Cespedes had against the Dodgers in the afternoon game that was started by Clayton Kershaw right before the A's played the Giants. So many of those things happen. And if you look back at 2001, not only the sweep against Arizona, but one of Bill King's all-time great calls when Giambi hit that home run off Mike Stanton on that Sunday afternoon. And when so things like that start to happen, then you really get the sense that something special is on the horizon.
And of course, Ken, it was 2001, and we can't forget about the tragic event of the 9/11 terrorist attack that shook our country during that season. And because the commissioner canceled some games, the A's, in fact, didn't resume play until September 18th in Texas. That was one of the most disturbing events that remind fans that baseball is just a game. What are some of your memories of being with the team during those somber moments in 2001, Ken?
Well, you're right, it is. And it reinforces there are times when real life intersects with baseball, and it makes baseball, for very good reason, take a back seat to what was going on in the country and around the world. And, of course, as you remember, the A's were scheduled to play the Texas Rangers in a game at the Coliseum on 9/11. And then, excuse me, I remember getting up and, sorry, Dale, getting up and watching the TV news that morning, and it was very clear that a terrible, awful tragedy was unfolding. And then, of course, you had to think about the reality, which was there was a game scheduled for that night, what was going to happen. And then word came down fairly quickly that the game was going to be canceled that night. And then there was that limbo period where we were waiting and not knowing how long they would postpone the games and how long the season would be delayed. And then, obviously, the season was delayed for a week, which I think was the right call because that was just so important for people to focus on the events of 9/11 and to let some sort of healing take place. And then when the A's resumed playing, we flew down to Arlington, Texas to play the Rangers with the resumption of the season. And I remember that was one of the more poignant flights I've ever been on. It was extremely quiet. There was security on the plane as the A's were flying from Oakland down to Texas. But at some point, you're professionals, not only broadcasters, but players. And I've always felt that that sports can facilitate the healing process. It can serve as that kind of a diversion, maybe an avenue for people to get back to a sense of normalcy. Dale, what had happened during 9/11 was at the forefront of all of our thinking as the season resumed. But the reality was that the A's were in the midst of this wonderful season. And then we opened the postseason against the Yankees at Yankee Stadium. And I remember the regular season ending for the A's that year with the game against the Angels down in Anaheim, and flew right after the game to New York to get ready for the American League Division Series. And it turned out to be a red-eye flight. And by the time the A's had landed in Newark, it was the middle of the night. And poignant is another word I would use. And a very, very quiet bus ride through the Lincoln Tunnel across into Manhattan. And all of us just quietly, I'm sure, wondering what the scene would be like, what the feel would be like in New York, what we would experience when we got there, and all were to wake up the next morning and try to kind of deal with these conflicting emotions or confluence of emotions, because here we were at 9/11, literally less than 1 month after the terrible tragedy, and yet the team was getting ready to go to Yankee Stadium to play a playoff game against the Yankees, the most storied franchise in baseball, in Yankee Stadium. So we knew there would be a lot of intensity. So that was really a moment, those moments there, and going to New York for that ALDS, and I talk about it fairly extensively, write about it in the book. Those was something that none of us will ever forget.
Mm-hmm. And 2001 can also mark the final hurrah for Jason Giambi as an Oakland A of that era. Of course, he briefly returned to the A's in 2009, but was a shell of himself. But Jason was the unquestioned team leader. He was the heart and soul of this club. And the A's, under owner Steve Schott at the time and Billy Beane, the GM, tried to sign Giambi to a $90 million deal in spring training of that season. But, of course, the A's refused to give him the no-trade clause as he requested. And Giambi's departure after that season was painful for many A's fans. And fans began to be conditioned to lose fan favorites because the A's simply couldn't afford to keep them. And your debut as a broadcaster with the A's kind of coincided with Giambi's arrival. What did he mean to this team?
He meant everything to the team. He was the ringleader in the clubhouse. Remember back in those days, they used to call the A's clubhouse a frat house.
Sure.
And Giambi was kind of right in the middle of all that. I've always said this about Jason. In all the years I've been in sports, I've never met a more cooperative player and a more unaffected superstar. Because as you can imagine, now he goes to New York and he's right in the center of the storm there. He never changed in terms of how accommodating he's always been. He treats everybody the same. He was a tremendous player, of course, for the A's. Everything revolved around him because he was the guy you counted on in the middle of the lineup. So if I look back at my time with the A's in my 18 years, Dale, I don't think I've had a more favorite player in terms of someone that I enjoyed watching play and also enjoyed dealing with. And even this last spring, had a chance to spend a nice morning with Jason reflecting on Bill King and talking about what Bill King meant to him, and also taking me through that entire at-bat that I mentioned earlier with Stanton when Bill said that Jason Giambi is the man in capital letters when he hits the home run off Stanton to win that game on that Sunday. And that's exactly what he was. That's what he meant to that team, Dale. He was the man in capital letters.
Mm-hmm. And so at the end of the season, the A's end up winning 102 games. As we mentioned, they win the wild card and faced the dreaded Yankees in the ALDS. And, of course, New York has so much fan support and sympathy because of the 9/11 attacks. And you have to remember, the Yankees barely squeaked by the A's in the ALDS the previous season. The A's took them to 5 games to the brink. So the A's, the best team in baseball at the time, many felt, they bring their swagger to New York for the playoffs. And immediately there's some controversy when Art Howe is quoted during the press conference as saying the Yankees are going to have to play their best baseball to beat us. And some of the New York tabloids ran with it. What do you remember most about heading into that series, the ALDS, in 2001, Ken?
Well, I remember that press conference, Dale. I'm glad you mentioned that because at old Yankee Stadium, which was an old place back then, there wasn't a lot of room. Like in many of the new parks, they have these giant, luxurious places where they hold press conference. And down in the bowels of Yankee Stadium, right between the two clubhouses, is where they used to have the press conference. And everybody would crowd in there, especially before a playoff series, because of the intensity of the focus on the series, and not only because of the New York media, but because of 9/11 and how soon the series would start right after the terrible tragedy. And you're right. As soon as I think what Art said was the Yankees better bring their A game. And as soon as he said that, I thought to myself, because I was in there, I said, it doesn't matter what else he says. He could talk for another hour, and everything else will take a back seat to what he said. And sure enough, in the tabloids, the next day they made a huge deal about that, as you said. In fact, I think one of the headlines was, "How dare he?" HOWE. There was stuff like that. Of course, then the A's go in and win the 2 games. They go in and they have Hudson and Mulder, and they win the first 2 games of the series, and they're taking a 2-0 lead going back to the Bay Area for Game 3.
Mm-hmm. And of course, as you mentioned, the A's stole the first 2 games at Yankee Stadium of the ALDS and returned to Oakland only needing 1 win to advance to the ALCS. And many point to Game 3, Ken, in Oakland as the pivotal moment. Zito pitches a gem and only gives up a solo homer to Posada, of course. And then we have the infamous Terrence Long double down the right field line that led to a Derek Jeter flip to nail a non-sliding Jeremy Giambi at home plate in the 7th inning. 11 years later, Ken, what is your take on that play?
Well, I've replayed it about 10,000 times like everybody has. And on a personal level, I've been asked a lot, Dale, people like yourself and other people around the Bay Area, to list some of my most memorable calls. And I've been fortunate and so thrilled to be involved in some amazing moments with the A's and have been on the air to describe some incredible things and feats that the A's have performed over the years. I don't want to say that call was the most memorable because it turned out to be one that was so ultimately disappointing. But I think it's the one that I've replayed in my mind so many times because when you're on the air and you're confronted with a play like that was as complex as the Jeremy Giambi play, that I've actually gone back and replayed it a lot, not only to try to figure out if he was safe or out, but also because of the complexity of the call and thinking, what could I have done differently if I had a chance to do it again? because, as you know, the play unfolded with the ball going down the right field line, and then Spencer going into the corner, and then Jeremy's rounding second going to third, and the throw comes in, and the Yankees have the double cut. They have Soriano out there, and the ball gets past him, and then they have Tino Martinez, and the ball goes past him, and it rolls into foul territory. And then here's this figure that flashes in front of my eyes, and honestly, I don't really pay attention too much to the numbers of the players, because after all these years, and especially when you're playing the Yankees, you just know their guys. So it's not like a football broadcast when you're memorizing the numbers, but I got lucky there, and when I kind of had one eye on Giambi rounding third and Wash with the green light, and one eye on this figure flashing before me in the foul territory. I saw the number 2 on his back, and so then instantly you know that it's Jeter, and then he makes the flip. And you look, it certainly turned the series around. It may have ended the series for the A's right then, because, as you know, it's a 1-0 game. It was a riveting pitching duel between Zito and Mike Messina on a beautiful early evening. There was a huge crowd at the Coliseum, and it was the kind of a night that you just live for as a fan, as a broadcaster, as a player. The weather was perfect here in the Bay Area. The place was packed. You had 2 great pitchers in their prime dueling pitch for pitch. And so in terms of the excitement and the energy and the intensity and what was at stake in the building, it was an amazing night, and it was like the air went right out of the balloon. It just, when that play happened at home plate, I think it just sucked the air right out of the building. And then the Yankees went on, and they brought Rivera in the game when he pitched the last 2 innings. Now the game's over. And then you'll recall in the game 4, the whole feel of the game was totally different.
Sure.
When the Yankees came out against the A's in game 4. It was a day game. It was warm. Everything was very slow and methodical. The energy wasn't there. El Duque was pitching, and it was taking him 20 seconds, 30 seconds between pitches. Jermaine Dive broke his leg on the foul ball in the first inning, and it really kind of felt like the series. It didn't end then, because the A's still had a chance to win Game 5 back in New York, but obviously there was a huge change in momentum in the favor of the Yankees.
And you have to give the Yankees credit. Down 2-0, headed to Oakland. Many felt they were left for dead.
Well, absolutely, and you just don't know what would have happened if Jeremy had slid. I think Kerwin Danley was the plate umpire, and I've been told that the feeling was that if Jeremy had slid, that the call would have been safe. You don't know that for sure, but you can replay it like you have. I'm sure, Dale, you've replayed it 1,000 times, like the rest of us have. It would have tied the game, and the A's would have had a chance to kind of keep the momentum that they had after winning the first 2 games in New York.
And of course,
but the A's had the misfortune of playing a lot of great teams. If you go back through that time when they lost the 5th game 4 straight years, 2000, 2001, 2002, and 2003, they matched up against some very good clubs. And I really thought the 2001 A's may have been the best team in baseball. They may have won the World Series that year, and they may have been better than other A's teams that advanced to the World Series in the past, because at that point the A's had played in 6 World Series going back to 1972. I'm not sure any of those other clubs were a whole lot better than the A's team that the A's had on the field in 2001.
And of course, as you mentioned earlier, Ken, the A's take the Yankees to 5 games to the brink in 2001 in the ALDS, and they lose a painful loss. And the A's were ahead in Game 5 in New York briefly. Then they had some errors and just a painful loss. And for the second consecutive year, the A's are eliminated in the first round of the playoffs. And after that season, Ken, as depicted in the movie Moneyball, the A's lose 3 components of that season. Jason Giambi proceeded to sign with the Yankees in December for $120 million. Once Giambi departed, other players followed suit. Days later, Johnny Damon signed a $30 million contract, 4-year contract with the Red Sox, and Jason Isringhausen signed a $27 million contract with the Cardinals. And, of course, the following season, the A's win 20 straight and 103 overall, and spurred a best-selling book and a movie after the season, Ken.
Well, they certainly did, and they still had Hudson, Mulder, and Zito, and Chavez, and Tejada, so they still had a good club going in there. But, they lost Giambi and lost Johnny Damon, and they lost their closer. So we didn't know, but I think we were conditioned to kind of have the sense that as long as they had the good pitching, that they would have a chance. And once again, as was the case in 2001, they got off to a very slow start, and they needed to win 20 straight games. People forget that the Angels had a great year in 2002. Of course, they would eventually win the World Series as the wild card team. But just to shake the Angels, because when the winning streak began that year, Dale, the A's were actually in second place. So they had to win 20 straight just to take over first place.
Any final memories of the 2001 season, Ken, as we let you go?
Well, yeah, it was a great year, but again, everything was it was all set against the backdrop of 9/11, and so many of my memories, and the memories come flooding back, and especially because I've been working on the book, as you know, Dale, and you've been so nice to mention it and bring it up. I talking to Jason about the 2001 season and going back and reliving some of my thoughts of being with Bill in the booth and Ray in 2001. And I remember a very somber bus ride because the A's had lost that fifth game, like you said, at Yankee Stadium, and a very, very somber bus ride on the New Jersey Turnpike after the game. It took forever to get out of the ballpark because we had a police escort, and then there were some concerns about security as the A's were on the bus and heading back to the airport at Newark, and that was as quiet and as somber and as difficult, I think, a trip maybe as the A's have ever been on after losing a series, because you push that hard and you get that far and you feel like you've really got a shot, and you never know if you're going to get to the World Series. I've been with some great teams with the A's, 6 postseasons in the last 13 years. We haven't gone to the World Series yet, so you wonder if that time will come. And that was a year where the A's really had a great shot. And sometimes, as Billy Beane said, it's a little bit of a crapshoot. You may not do anything terribly wrong, and maybe you don't deserve it, but that's the way it goes in a 5-game series. And, of course, the Yankees had a very good team that year. They had a great team, so hats off to them.
And you mentioned your upcoming book about Bill King, Ken. We haven't spoken since March. Can you tell our listeners any updates about the book, the time frame is going to be released, and any other information?
Well, we're working hard on it. I'm working hard with my editor, Steve Ketman, and another editor by the name of Pete Danko. They're both doing great jobs in helping with the process. And I don't know when it's going to come out, Dale. I would hope it would come out before the end of the season. We're just trying to do as thorough a job as possible, which I think is required when you're doing a Bill King book.
Absolutely.
Because it's not just the A's, it's the Raiders, it's the Warriors, it's his painting, it's his Russian history and speaking Russian, it's his sailing, it's the opera, the ballet. This man was so multifaceted and layered that's why we're doing the book about him. So it does take time, and the editing process is painstaking. But I think the number of interviews, I don't know how many I mentioned when we talked before, Dale, but I think I'm up to about 55 interviews.
Wow.
And so many of them have been fascinating, and the reason that I've kept this energy up for doing the book is because everybody I talk to has had this passion for talking about Bill. And once I hang up the phone or talk to somebody in person, then I just can't wait to get to the computer and start writing again. And as far as it relates to the A's, we decided to do an entire chapter on the 20-game winning streak.
Nice.
So there's not only the story of Bill joining the A's in 1981 and then the legendary and incredible pairing with Lon Simmons in that whole time, and then the 10 years that Bill and I spent together. We decided to write a chapter on the 2002 winning streak, and I talked to Scott Hatterberg about it. Obviously, Billy Beane went into great detail about not only his reflections on the season, but how the movie kind of took off. They finally were able to get a movie after, as you know, there were several scripts that were written. They went back and forth to the studios, really didn't have anything, and until they decided that the winning streak would be the centerpiece of the movie, and as Billy said, they would build out from there. Then they had a movie, and so the winning streak was such a integral part of that. And Bill's call of Hatterberg's home run was the perfect punctuation. So there's something magical in that. I talked to Art Howe about the streak, and some of his thoughts as that 20th game was unfolding. So there will be a lot of memories in the book, and we're doing the best we can. That's all I can say.
And I'm speaking for many A's fans. We can't wait to get a copy of that book, Ken. So keep up the great work, and I know it's going to be special, and I think you're gonna do Bill King good.
Well, I hope so, Dale, and I really appreciate all of your support. It's been great.
That's Ken Korach. I'm Dale Tafoya. Thanks for listening, A's fans. And Ken, thank you for joining us to remember the 2001 A's.